So I want to welcome everyone here today. You've just heard that this afternoon's program is being recorded. So today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Éilís Ní Dhuibhne to the Mahindra Humanities Seminar in Celtic Literature and Culture at Harvard. Éilís is the Burns Visiting Scholar at Boston College this fall. She is an award-winning novelist, short story writer, and playwright, and she publishes in both Irish and English. She has nearly 30 books to her name, the latest of which was just published this fall. Some of you probably zoomed into the Boston College launch of Little Red and Other Stories a couple weeks ago. I know I did. She also has a forthcoming edited collection of autobiographical essays by women writers called Look, It's a Woman Writer. And the publication of that has been delayed by the pandemic, but I believe we heard a couple weeks ago that it'll be out before too long. And in 2018, she published a celebrated memoir titled 12,000 Days, a memoir of love and loss, about her life with her late husband, Boo Almquist, who was professor of Irish and director of the Irish National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin. Éilís is also a folklorist. Her PhD in folklore is from UCD, and she is the president of the Folklore of Ireland Society. She has several folklore articles and book chapters to her name, the next of which, or perhaps I should say, one of the next of which will be about the early 19th century folklore collector Thomas Crofton Croker and his connection with the Grimm brothers. And she's working on this for the International Grimm Ripples Project, which is exploring the Grimm's influence across Northern Europe. Her talk for us today is about a somewhat more recent folkloric topic. And I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I'm very much looking forward to hearing all about Boo and Mícheál, Collection and Connection, a Swedish folklorist and a Kerry storyteller, Boo Almquist and Mícheál Gaoithín. So please welcome Éilís Ní Dhuibhne with your best silent Zoom búlabás.
Well, thank you very much, Natasha, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to everybody who has come along from all over the world, more or less. So I hope you enjoy this talk tonight, which is very, I think, relaxed and kind of informal, and where most of the talk is coming not really from me, but mostly from Boo Almquist, in fact. So I'll get going. It'll take about an hour, and then I hope we might have a little bit of time for discussion afterwards. In a lecture entitled The Narrative Performance of an Irish Storyteller, which Boo Almquist gave to the Folklore Society in London in 1978, it was the centenary of the Folklore Society, he said this, though Mehall, that's Mehall Gaoithín, of course, though Mehall welcomed me at any hour of the day, he preferred to tell his stories at night. They would be better that way, he assured me. And to judge by comparisons of versions told by Mehall in these years and the same tales told later in Dingle Hospital in daylight, he would appear to be right. The fire, which is such a central element in Irish life and which figures in Mehall's memories of the storytelling sessions of his youth, was always lit when I came to collect. There was no electricity in the house and the paraffin lamp was seldom lit, so the fire provided the only light. And the house was, as it were, impregnated with stories. It was in this very house that Mehall's maternal grandfather, Thomas Sayers, had died at the age of 98, shortly after having gone astray in the story of the Red Ox, the only time he had ever gone astray in a story. It was a strange experience to hear Mehall telling the very same story, his voice streaming through the stillness of the night, which was otherwise only interrupted by braying donkeys and corncrakes, descendants of those, no doubt, who had taken the same part when his grandfather told the tales. So Mehall was the son of the most famous of all Irish storytellers, I think it's fair to say. I'm going to just be foostering a little tiny bit here. I think it should all be okay. The Peg Sayers. That's Mehall, and in case you have forgotten what Peg looks like, there's Peg. He was the son of Peg Sayers and of Pádraig Gaoithín or Patsy Flint. Mehall was the 7th child in the family. He lived on the Blasket from his birth until 1942, with a brief hiatus in 1929. According to his friend Seoirse McCoy, George Thompson, the classical scholar who visited the Blasket for extended periods, Mehall was intelligent and quiet. We became close friends, wrote McCoy. He was different from the other boys, studious and introspective. It was his great hope that one day he might go to college. This is a foreword which George Thompson wrote to A Pity Youth Does Not Last, an English translation of Mehall's memoir Through Enough on an Oiga, the original came out in 1953, if I'm not mistaken, and the translation considerably later. Robert Kniegel, a much later writer who did not know Mehall, writes in his book On an Irish Island. He was imaginative, smart, and one of only a few islanders who could read and write in Irish. When he was 15, he had a poem published in an Irish language publication. And indeed, Mehall was writing from an early age. He kept a diary and he was often composing poetry or writing. During his youth, a kind of golden age was occurring on the Blasket. It wasn't a time of material prosperity. The islanders were always poor, living in a subsistence economy, fishing, growing potatoes, keeping sheep, and so on. But during the period from the time of the revival, from about 1900 to 1939, the island was a magnet for scholars of all kinds, academic scholars, students learning Irish, ordinary tourists to some extent. Among the more well-known visitors were John Millington Synge, who came in 1905, and his account of that is really very wonderful, I think, in Wicklow and West Kerry. A bit later, 2007, Carl Marstrander. Robin Flower came in 2010. George Thompson, guided by Robin Flower, came at some stage after that. Other visitors were Mary Louise Chestet, Breen O'Callig, a Trinity student of significance, since it was he who encouraged the writing of Tomás Cruithan's On Talánach by some simple means, which included giving Tomás a pen and paper. Indeed, much later, Maria Simmons Gooding, who was here, encouraged Mehall Gaoithín to paint and draw pictures, and also thoughtfully provided him with paper and crayons and paints. And otherwise, that wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have made the pictures which he did. Back to the island, the visitors who were interested in learning or practicing their Irish or collecting stories almost always made the acquaintance of Peg, Mehall's mother. She and Tomás Cruithan were known as excellent speakers, and they could help people learn or polish their language skills. And of course, Peg would tell stories as well. So during Mehall's youth, the island was building up its reputation as a place of unique character, inhabited by exceptionally talented people whose Irish and lore was even better than that on the adjacent mainland. Joan and Ray Stagles, American visitors to the Blasket in the 1960s, wrote in their book, The Blasket Island, Next Parish, America, 1980. For some people, any island exerts an irresistible attraction. Many have felt the pull of the Great Blasket long before they actually saw it. For the Blasket, out of all the Irish islands, and there are said to be 300 of them, has been especially blessed with a small but vigorous population of distinctive character and intelligence and outstanding literary gifts. So the Blasket Island has, uninhabited since 1953, has an iconic status in Ireland, and I think it's deserved. At least 20 books were written by the islanders, by 10 writers, between 1928, when Tomás Ó Cruthain published his first book, Almqvist, and 2012, when Gearóid Ó Catháin, the last child born on the island, published his The Loneliest Boy in the World. And given that the population of the Blasket was at its height, 176, that was in 1916, it's a significant achievement. As an aside, I'll add that Boo believed that the status of the Blasket Island as a place with a special, unique oral culture was overstated, and maintained, I think, with a certain amount, with correctness, based on the evidence of his own research and knowledge of the folklore, was that as far as tradition was concerned, the island was part of the zone, which included the mainland parishes like Dunquin and Ballyferrisher. And of course, those mainland parishes have also produced and continue to produce an unusually large number of writers. Anyway, Mehall grew up on this special island, an islander, but one who was continually in touch with outsiders from many parts of the world, especially, I think it's quite true to say, from the academic world. So he was a person on the cusp of the oral and literary worlds, who was suited to life as a scholar or an artist as a writer. And indeed, I met another Kerry storyteller. I never met Mehall Ó Gaoithín. He died in 1974 before I was going to Dunquin. But Bob Ferreter, Cod Ferreter, also said to me and Boo that she would have loved to get an education and become a teacher or a professor, or in her case, an actor, a profession she would have been well suited to. But she didn't, and Mehall didn't attend school after primary school. Like everyone else, he worked on the island as a fisherman and a small farmer. And though he was tall and strong, the work didn't suit him. In his own introduction to his memoir, Through an Fannin on Oiga, Mehall wrote, Níor thráchttas na hanróí of Mora the rugorm gomininic nor a bhín ag íscoch, Dáin beidir nach machtaí na buicdom mar the bhach ashlingi u fásacha ag lucht de leite, and which is, I didn't describe the hardships, the big hardships that I experienced when I was out fishing. If I did, people mightn't be too thankful because they would have terrible dreams. But I think perhaps it was Mehall who had the terrible dreams. The Island by Mehall. It's Through enough on Noige. In 1929, the year in which the most famous of all the Blasket books, on Tilánach, was published, Mehall emigrated to America. He came to Springfield, Massachusetts, where his sister, his brother, and other relatives already lived. In his memoir, he tells us he enjoyed the trip, the voyage across the Atlantic, but he did not thrive in America. He's said to have failed to find work, although since he complains about a foreman in his own account, he must have had a job at some point, but he didn't stay for long in the United States. I can never find out how long he actually stayed, a couple of months or a little longer, but he returned home. Of course, it wasn't a good time to come to America, thanks to the Depression, or as Mehall always called it, the oppression. So he returned to the island and he lived there with Peg until 1942, at which point they left the island and settled in Dunquin, just a few miles across the Blasket Sound, here in Ballyvicora. That's Mehall actually outside the house, the cottage in Ballyvicora. And here's another one of Ballyvicora. And then he stayed there until 1969, when he became ill. He was admitted to the hospital in Dingle, and although he recovered, he stayed in the hospital, which functioned as a sort of home for old people, until he died quite suddenly in 1974. During his lifetime, he published a collection of poems, Cín le Cora, his own memoir, and Peg's biography, as well as many articles and pieces in magazines like Mishnach and so on. And he also made many pictures and drawings in later life. But it's as a storyteller that he was perhaps most talented and important, especially as far as I am concerned. And so enter Boo Almquist. We don't usually give as much information, biographical information about folklore scholars as we do about the folk, and whether we should or not is a moot point. I'll talk about that a bit later. Boo himself, who was given to citing proverbs and quotations from poems and saws, liked to say that folklore scholars always came from somewhere, by which he meant somewhere interesting and folksy and traditional. And I think he was quoting, it was Seamus O' the Larga who used to say that. So Boo was born in that kind of place in Värmland in Sweden in 1931. Värmland is one of the least populated areas of Sweden, the Leitrim of Sweden, Boo used to say, on the border with Norway. But he came from a middle-class family. His father was a district police superintendent, a lanesman, and they lived in a big house and had the first Volvo in the parish and all that sort of thing. But his friends were as poor as church mice, as Boo colourfully put it, as people were often in pre-war Sweden. I think Sweden, you know, got rich after the war. He spoke in the Värmland dialect until he went to school. And even when he spoke standard Swedish, he had a strong Värmland accent. His mother, in fact, Boo told me that somebody had told him once that they had never met a professor or an educated Swede with such a strong regional accent as Boo had. But I wouldn't really have, he was the Swede I heard most of the time, so I wouldn't really have noticed that. He knew, his mother, Hulda, had a lot of proverbs, a vast store of proverbs, and that might have exerted some influence on Boo's interests. He studied Nordic literature and language and folklore and English in Uppsala University. When he graduated, he spent a year on a scholarship in Reykjavik, in Iceland. Then he came back and did his military service, which was mandatory then and which he did not enjoy. The day his military service ended, he boarded a boat, not for Ireland, I'm afraid, but for Iceland, which was his other, the other country that Boo loved apart from Sweden. He was advised by his professor and doctoral supervisor and mentor and friend, Dag Strömbeck, that every folklorist should learn an unusual language as well as an ordinary language, as well as ordinary languages like French and German and those kind of languages. So Icelandic seems like a pretty unusual language to most of us, I think, but it mightn't have been that exotic for a speaker of another Scandinavian language like Swedish, because Boo told Lawrence Tulloch, a friend of his in Shetland, Lawrence asked him how long it had taken him to learn Icelandic, and he said about 6 months. And then he said, well, how long did it take you to learn Irish? And he said about 20 years. So there was, I'm sure, a bit of exaggeration on both sides, but nevertheless, it indicates something. So Boo told me it was once a toss-up for him between Finnish and Irish, but he decided on Irish. And in fact, he was always a little bit regretful that he hadn't learned Finnish as well. Be that as it may, Irish was the one. Boo first visited Ireland in 1954 at the UCD, University College Dublin Summer School, just for about a month, which was spent in Dublin. In 1957, he got some money, he says enigmatically, not explaining how. I think it might have been a little inheritance from an uncle of his who died. Anyway, when you get some money, what do? You go to Ireland for 3 months. And that's what he did. He went to Dunquin from Iceland. He'd already learnt a bit of Irish in Uppsala, where Kevin Danaher of the Irish Folklore Commission was a lecturer in Irish for a year, I think, while Boo was a student there. And Boo had continued to work on Irish in Reykjavik with his friends Helgi Sigurdsson, who had quite good Irish, and Gearóid McCoy, who later became Professor of Old Irish in University College Galway. But anyway, in 1957, he made his way to Dunquin himself. Seamus Ó Larga advised him to go there. And I think if Delargy had said you should go to Galway or Donegal, Boo would probably have taken his advice. So a lot depends on Delargy. And now we're going to listen to Boo describing his first visit to Dunquin.
When I came then to Ireland, to Dublin in '57, and May, I believe it was, I stayed for a couple of days around here and met Seamus Ó Larga again, and I got various advice from him and also from Sean Sullivan. And then I set out for Dunquin, and strangely, on the way to Dunquin, however that happened, that there was some station, we stopped Mehall or something like that, I met a Swede who was coming from Dunquin, a man by the name of Éilís Ní Dhuibhne, who also was his comparative linguist, and one also who became a professor in Gothenburg, and one also knew Sanskrit and lots of peculiar languages, and who also studied Irish and was at some stage, or still is, quite a fluent speaker of Irish. They were the people who attacked the language because of its intricate grammar and sound structure and such matters that interested me moderately, but anyhow, they were very nice people. And this Folklorist is his name. He was recently retired and got a festskrift that I can show you later, very peculiar because it contains articles about some 20 different languages. And I contributed an article in that on loanword, Scottish Gaelic loanword in the Orkney Saga, and detail that hangs with that. But anyhow, he taught me getting more and more long.
Oops, sorry. Sorry, I'll just go back to it. That was my fault. I touched something.
When I came then to Ireland, to Dublin in '57, and May, I believe it was, I stayed for a couple of days around here and met Kerry, and I arrived a wrong day, so I took a taxi.
Sorry, folks, I'll just get back on track here with this. There's just a nice little bit. Well, I'll just tell you what it is, and then I'll go back to the tape. This linguistic scholar, whose name I think Folke Isaacson is not his name, and maybe if any linguistic people are here, they might have some idea of who was a Swedish professor of linguistic in Gothenburg. If you know, in the 1960s. Anyway, Fogmichin Marhoshe, but whoever he was, at Mallow Station where Boo met him, he taught him a very useful phrase, as Boo says in the tape, which is Cade an bhrí atá le sin. What is the meaning of that? And Boo said that was a phrase which he was able to use very often when he got to Dunquin. Oh, I'm sorry, I am now. What has happened to my cursor?
when I came then so that was fine, and picked up a couple of useful phrases, walking down with Tom.
Were you always speaking Irish with him?
Yeah, we're trying to.
Yeah.
But of course he didn't think much of my attempts actually. But after 2 months he was saying you're making progress. And of course, I mean, they always spoke about the weather, and the weather was always the same. It was a slight fog, and so I remember the first time we walked down. He said to the first person he met, "Ta sig bra boka kärn." And then I met another man, and he said to him, "Ta sig bra boka kärn." He was also called down. So when he came to the third man, I said, "Ta sig bra boka kärn." But his name was Mehall. So, but in this way.
And now he will talk about
Then during that time
Mehall.
in Gaoithín met another man that has been the ruination and great joy in my life, namely Mehall. And I've been advised, of course, to see him. It took me some time before I got the courage to come up and see him. And he wasn't home. I met a man who was driving a donkey over Almqvist with the turf that he had taken up, cut up in the mountain there, Sveanoller. And this man turned out to be, I learned many years later, was Sean Fats Tom, and well-known islandman, whom I also became a very good friend with later on. And he reminded me of that you remember the first day when he came up to see me from Philip. And she said he's up there, and he was up in the mountain too, supposedly cutting turf, but in reality he was lying flat on his back. Perhaps composing poetry, which you always did in a lying position. And I was very taken aback by that the first time I caught him in the actual act. But that would have been later on 66 or 67, 65 perhaps. He was laying on the settle bed, and I heard into total darkness, and I heard say, I was very much afraid that he was ill, but he was in fact composing poetry. Now, I got the greetings from Fieldwork and John Sullivan and conveyed them to him, I suppose in English or faulty Irish, and he got the idea that caught on to right, understood that I was interested in folk tales, so he told me one immediately, and that was about an hour and a half without interruption, and I have later, I just barely been able to identify which folk tale it was, and I have collected it on later occasions. Very intricate it is a combination of several numbers, and it includes Aristotle. Tror makna barskollågan, it is called. Anyhow.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that glitch. Oops, and I have to get Boo to shut up now. Stop, Boo. There. Yeah, I'm sorry. That something always happens. I lost the cursor for some reason. So that's Boo talking about the first time he came to Dunqueen. I hope you could hear it properly. Good. And so he met Mehall just at the very end of that summer in 1957. He spent 3 months there. I think he's modest about his Gaeilge, but I'd say it was reasonably good at the end. He does give an account, and this is the bit you lost in the middle, where he's talking about how he learned Irish. And I think this is well, it's very instructive for me anyway, as to this is the way you should learn a language. He would be upstairs in the farmhouse where he was staying, the Tommaso Crohore's house on Caharoo. It's still there, beside Carl Porter's house, or close to us, Maura Trass's house, people will know it as. And Boo had some books, Jimeen Morahaig and a few others that he had brought with him. And he would read Jimeen Morahaig up in the room and translate, presumably to Swedish. And then he would go downstairs, and the Banatee, Banny Crohore, I'm not sure, he doesn't actually mention her first name, was always sitting by the fire because she hadn't got good mobility. She couldn't walk actually at that stage. So she was always there. And Boo would read, I'd say sentence by sentence, what he had been working on up in the room. And she would, he says, try to figure out what it was he was trying to say. She couldn't read Irish, like she could read English, but she could not read Irish. And if she could guess what it was, she would say it in good Dunqueen Irish, and then he'd repeat it. And you know, that's how you do it for 3 months. So there's no shortcuts, as Boo used to say. In scholarships, there are no shortcuts, and neither are there in learning languages. So that's how it was. By the way, I should also say that this tape, which I have played, of Boo talking about his own life, is an interview which his former student, Dr. Anne O'Connor, now editor of Bailides, made. Anne very brilliantly, thoughtfully, wisely did some interviews with Boo in 2006. That tape is from 2006. So we have the account from him, from the horse's mouth, thanks to Anne. Yeah, I'll be talking a bit more about that towards the end. Anyway, 1957, Boo went back to Iceland. His life changed. He got married. He had a daughter. He was working in the University of Iceland as a lecturer in Swedish. And then in 1961, I think he left Iceland for Sweden, where he finished his doctoral thesis on satiric poetry in medieval Iceland, Norna Ní Dhuibhne. And he began to lecture in folklore in the University of Uppsala, where he stayed until 1971, when he came to Ireland. So his next visit to Dunquin was from Sweden in 1966. Boo got, in this case, he got money funding from the university for, or some such institution, for a 6-month sabbatical trip abroad, and he was allowed to break it up into 3 segments. So he was able to spend 3 summers in Dunqueen. And actually, for the rest of Boo's life, from 1966 until he died, he spent a couple of months a year during the summer in Dunqueen. So his serious collecting from Mehall began in that summer of 1966. He had a tape recorder then, and he began to collect from him. And this is how Boo describes Mehall and that summer in a lecture he gave to his students in Uppsala in the autumn of 1966. And I found a copy of this lecture in a folder with other such material. It's in the National Folklore Collection now. It's in the folder called Preliminary Index. It's in there. And it's in Swedish. I've translated it to English. He starts off telling the story of the red ox, which I've referred to already. Peg tells the story. I'll just tell a little bit of it because it's quite good. Tomas is telling the story of the red ox in Ballyvicora, and Peg is there listening, his daughter, and he hesitates. He forgets a bit. In many of you know the story. He forgets something in the middle of the story, and there wasn't a word out of him for a while. Peg says, "I believe death is drawing near to you." And he says, "I don't think so." "Oh, indeed, that's what's happening," she says. "The end is coming. You never hesitated in the middle of a story until tonight, as far as I remember." And he says, "Death has not left Cork yet, my girl, on his way to me." But Death had done that because he never managed to finish the story, and he lived he lived only 9 days later, so I think Death might have made it from Cork, but anyway. And Boo goes on to say, "It's an old belief that to hesitate or make a mistake in telling a story is a death omen. There are parallels in the Icelandic sagas." This is a very Boo thing to say. I think he said that about so many pieces of lore that he heard in Ireland and in Dunqueen. So Boo goes on in this lecture. Mehall, or Unfilla, as he is always called, in Dunqueen everyone has a nickname, is over 60 years old. Once I have been told he suffered a stroke, and maybe that explains why he sometimes trembles. But for the most, he has excellent health. And just like his mother, he is very intelligent and speaks eloquently and with great liveliness. He has no work now, but once he was a good fisherman, and he's thin and strong like most of the men in Dunquin. By comparison with us, by comparison with us in Sweden in the 1960s, everyone in Dunquin is poor, apart from the man who owns the pub. But Mehall is the poorest of all. He told me once that all he owns is his little house and his 4-footed cat. The house is small, 1 room and a bedroom. The cat is red-haired and skinny and has a wild look. But Mehall is happy with both. I never heard him complain. He cuts turf himself for the fire, and he buys bread and milk from the neighbours with the small royalties he gets on his mother's books. I never saw him eating proper food, and there are people in Dunquin who say he lives on bread and milk. Not that he is a vegetarian, Boo goes on to say. Anyway, he loves smoking his pipe, though I think you can smoke a pipe if you're a vegetarian, and he would drink a pint of beer if it were available. I knew Mehall from my first visit in 1957. He was friendly from the start and promised to teach me to speak a language which would be closer to Irish than whatever I was speaking at the time. So in that way, he was my teacher and my friend. And every day for the 3 months, I walked the 2 kilometers to his cottage. Sometimes I came in the afternoon, sometimes at night when only the fire lit the darkness in the almost tropical Irish summer night. It must have been a very good summer. There was no electricity in the house, and Mehall seldom had a lamp. I would spend 3 or 4 hours with him every day. Gradually, we developed a sort of ritual. We would begin chatting about the neighbours and the things that were happening in the parish, farm work, fishing, the parish priest, tourists, the weather, of course. I learned a lot from these sessions. Then Mehall would read a piece from one of the local books, and I noted the words and phrases I didn't understand, and I asked what they meant when he was finished. He knew English if he wanted to, but he rarely felt like speaking it. He was clever at finding ways to explain words with synonyms and description. After this part of the ritual came the important bit. I would have 2 bottles of beer in my bag, and we'd drink them. We followed the proverb, dus deoch an sin scéil, first a drink, then a story. Then he would start telling stories. We always drank Carlsberg in memory of the story he had told me in 1957 about the Heather beer or the Viking beer. He would tell stories and I recorded them on tape. Usually he would narrate for half an hour or 40 minutes, but sometimes for much longer. During that summer, I taped between 30 and 40 hours. I had a simple tape recorder that I could carry. I could understand the recordings for the most part. As I said, he spoke nasally and he'd be swinging back and forth in the chair. It squeaked. And as for my chair, it had 3 long legs and 1 short. And then he goes on to say in this lecture, I'd no experience of interviewing people, but it wasn't necessary. Mehall would think of stories before he came, asking what kind of story he wanted to hear. And then he'd start and he could go on without stopping for hours, and there was no chance to interrupt him. And he was as fluent in talking about other things as telling stories. I heard him describing how they built houses or boats in the old days, talking for an hour without stopping in an efficient and coherent way, as if he were reading a script. Indeed, listening to Mehall, it's hard not to imagine that he and other Irish storytellers are like actors and that they have a script inside their heads, like an invisible manuscript. And he goes on to say that the better I got to know Mehall, the more I admired him as an artist and as a person. He never complained. He never complained about his status. I never heard him utter a bad word about anybody, except somebody whose Irish was bad. That annoyed him. Or the priest. He thought the priests were miserly. And Boo says he knew perfectly well that he was the best storyteller in the parish, and he was in the district, and he was very proud of that. And the lecture goes on in that way. So in that kind of vein of enthusiastic admiration for the master storyteller. So Boo continued to collect from Mehall every summer, 1966, 67, 68, 69, until 1973, even after Mehall moved into the hospital in Dingle. In notes which were written in 1971, Boo writes, the stories collected from 66 to 68 were all told in or outside Mehall's cottage in Ballyvicora. The others, except for those collected on a one-day tour in February, when Mehall must have got out for the day to go home, they were taken down in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Dingle. Most of the stories taken down in 1969, Mehall told lying in bed. In the summer of 1970, when his health had somewhat improved, the recordings took place in a sitting room. And this summer, 71, we have occasionally had story sessions in the park outside the hospital. The different surroundings and the varying state of the storyteller's health may have some influence on his recital. His eagerness to share his traditions with me, however, in no way abated during his illness, and I have often encountered great difficulties in my attempts to prevent him from telling many long stories on one occasion for fear he would overstrain himself. And this is all, this material, these notes are all to be found in a folder called the Preliminary Index 1971, which is in the Folklore Archive in UCD. So now we will listen just briefly, a little bit to Mehall. I want you to hear Mehall's voice, and I hope this goes okay. I think it seems to be back to normal now. So I'm just going to play a tiny little bit of Mehall. A story which is known to many of you. Reading was better. This is on Baltimore, Agus on Thorshore, the bailiff and the devil. Here we go. Why isn't it coming?
Agus an tarnanaíoch coste da sinne se idir siú bhóri dom pichéle dochta bhóri agus sa chain bhóri hí an díal gan tú suas an peal biniusi a go agus a níaba agus é was an má agus í máile lehéile an agus idir cadóid.
Okay, so I'll just, oops. I'll just translate that little bit very briefly for you. This is the big bailiff and on Torshore, the devil. I think literally the adversary, but it's a word that is used for the devil sometimes. Long ago in the old days, Fado Reeves Satana, I'm sure that's very Mehall to say something 3 times when you could say it once. The big bailiff and the man of the horns, the cross of God between us and him, they were going along the road together, and as they were talking, the devil was dressed up like a fine gentleman in a suit and in nice clothes and in the height of fashion, and the bailiff was fat and healthy in himself, and they were talking away to each other, and the story goes on. It's a story which is very well known to me because this is the one I wrote my PhD thesis on, 81186 with Whole Heart, which is an international tale found in many countries in Europe and obviously including Ireland, and is most well known because it is used by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. It's the Friar's Tale, but Mehall, there are 5 or 6 versions from Mehall. So that was just to get a sense of what Mehall was like. Anyway, I'm moving along towards the end. Boo's collections from Mehall amount to about 250 stories and around 2,000 proverbs. All the material is transcribed by Boo and his friend and colleague Dóthaí Ó Thógáin. Boo spent much of his summertime in Dunquin transcribing the tapes, and Mehall's voice was to be heard as a background to our family life for many summers in Dunquin. And then when Boo came back to Dublin, Dóthaí and Boo would meet every Thursday afternoon to transcribe and then edit and annotate this material. So the transcribed stuff, sorry. I'll stop the share and go back into it again. These are just to see, oh, he doesn't want to go away. These are the Mehall Gaoithín folders. The family has given all of them to the Irish Folklore Collection, and they're now stored in the archive there. The texts are also on external hard drives and on Boo's old computer, which is still functioning, or was when I left Dublin in August. The material is very well organized, transcribed, typed. There are notes on the tail types, on analogues. Every printed item written by Mehall in magazines that Boo could trace, which was probably quite a lot of it, is included. And there are indexes and lists of stories and Shanakas collected, and they're all included in the collection. For instance, one folder includes what Boo called a preliminary index, which lists all Mehall's sources. He learned most of his stories from his mother Peg, but 34 other sources are listed as well. Boo himself wrote many articles about various stories collected from Mehall and about Mehall and Peg, which were mostly published in Béileadus and in other journals. It was his and Dóthaí's intention to publish Mehall's stories in their entirety, and also to publish the entire repertoire of Peg's Sares, which they had edited and had almost ready for publication when they died. Dóthaí in 2011 and Boo in 2013. I would like to say that Pádraig Ó Héley has recently, just actually about a month or so ago, brought out this collection of some stories by Peg Sayers, Níl Dara Rota, which he and Boo were editing, and which Pádraig has, thank goodness, Pádraig completed the work, and it's there. The project, the ambition to publish all the material always seemed to me rather ambitious, since the repertoires of both Peg and Mehall are so extensive and would require a number of volumes apiece. However, most of the work has been done on both these collections. I had hoped I would do something myself with them, but typically I have not done that. So it still awaits work by somebody to get it finally, published in some way. It hasn't been translated to English except for some stories, such as the one I played, and others translated by Boo for articles. And I think the moral of this story is publish your work before you die. But I guess we will always have nachlass, and that's how it is as well. And I think the other lesson is collect from the folklorists as well as from the folk. Boo belonged to a generation of folklorists and scholars who prized the collected material above all else. Collegita quae superaver und fragmenta ne periant, as we say in the Folklore of Ireland Society. It's the motto of the Folklore of Ireland Society, An Cumann le Béile de Saorann, which was founded in 1927 and is the forerunner, later. We have the Irish Folklore Commission, 1935, and finally the Department of Irish Folklore and the National Folklore Collection in UCD, and so on. They're all connected. I think for Boo, and maybe for Seamus Ó Larga certainly, and maybe for some of Boo's colleagues like Dóigí and Seamus O'Connell and so on, the key goal really was to collect and preserve, and then edit, teach, analyze the material collected, the folklore, the stories. Boo was especially interested in oral narrative, in folk tales and legends, particularly in legends. His own scholarship consisted mainly of deep investigation of individual narratives and motifs, links between Irish and Scandinavian oral tradition, the connections of oral and written narrative in the Middle Ages. He did write a few pieces about his collecting experiences with Mehall and with Bob Fairtear, who kind of succeeded Mehall as Boo's main storyteller in Dunquin in the 1970s and 80s and up to the 90s. And although he clearly greatly treasured his relationships with them and with other storytellers, he didn't write much. He didn't write a great deal about his personal connections or his experience in the field in the way that, say, Henry Glassy does in his fantastic books on, passing the time in Ballymonone, or Ray Cashman in Storytelling on an Irish border, Northern Irish border. Those kind of, indeed, Boo did argue with me sometimes that the material that he collected was so rich and compelling in itself that detailed memoir-like novelistic accounts of the fieldwork was kind of beside the point. And I get that. I think the stories are of primary importance, and the work of collecting, transcribing, editing, annotating was, well, first of all, enormously demanding and time-consuming. There was such a huge amount of work and that went into all this, and the results are hugely significant for Irish folklore research. I mean, they have to be there, and they are there. But the story of how the collecting happened, and the give and take between the collector and the one who is collected from, the storyteller, I think is also fascinating and deserves documentation. For Boo's fieldwork, we rely on sporadic accounts scattered across journals, in lectures given to students and societies, often in introductions to books, which are quite a good source for this sort of thing, I'm finding. Also with Thomas Croft and Croker, it's harder to do it if they're 200 years dead. It's easier if they're around. So so that's where we're getting the information from, and on these tapes. It strikes me actually as extraordinary and stupid that I never collected Boo's life story from him, but this is the sort of thing that happens. Fortunately, another former student, Anne O'Connor, did so, and it's from these recordings made in 2006, 2007, that the account from Boo I played there, that it's Anne O'Connor's interview. Another folklorist, Frederick Scott, interviewed Boo over a couple of days in 2012 on video, and those recordings are now in the archive in Gothenburg, so they're there. I think it's also important to hear the voices of the storytellers and of all involved, since what we're dealing with is the oral tradition with sounds transmitted by the human voice, which we have only very recently, subspecia aeternitatis, to use one of Boo's very frequent phrases, began to preserve at all, a matter of regret to any folklore scholar trying to trace the history of our origins of folklore. I mean, it's so recent that we can catch the voices. Now we take it for granted, but since the advent of sound recording, we can now not just read the accounts of the voice of the storyteller and the cornquake and the donkey, we can listen to them as well long after the speakers have left us. And I always feel that the soul of the person, if it's anywhere, is actually in the voice. It seems that's my little romantic. I'm not very romantic about anything, but I have that feeling about it. So I'll finish just reading a little poem, which is kind of negative, by Derek Mahon, which I came across, called The Early Anthropologists. You can maybe say the early folklorists. He says, anthropology has carried its basket of apples a long way and is tired. Once it studied man, now it studies the study of man. Soon it will study, and you know, he seems to be a little bit skeptical about the meta stuff, but I'm not in agreement with him. I'm going to give the last word to the folklorist I have been looking at today, Boo Almquist. In a piece he published in an article in Hereditas in 1975, a Festschrift, I think, for somebody. He writes, in the archives of the Department of Irish Folklore, there are 8,000 odd pages written by Mehall himself. Mehall also collected folklore in his characteristic and beautiful hand. Often Mehall did not even stop to draw breath after finishing one tale before telling another, which seemed in some way connected with the first one. It didn't seem to matter whether the subject was fairies or ghosts, seals or cats, birth or death, or anything. Story followed upon story. Mehall's ability to come up with something new and unexpected never failed to astonish and fascinate me. When I left him in the autumn of 1973, after 8 summers collecting, I thought I had perhaps managed to empty his repertoire of tales. But I was mistaken, for when I returned to Kerry over the Easter holidays in 1974, Mehall had several new stories to tell me that I had not met with before. One of these stories dealt with the experiences of a fisherman in heaven. On the card I write out, in order to keep track of my tape recordings, I have written "End of this session" under the title of this tale. But it was to be the end of all my sessions, because he died suddenly and unexpectedly a week after I left him on April the 27th, 1974. Go dogad dia suvnas na vlahas though, and Shin Mushkale. So I would like to thank these people. I'm sure I've left out somebody, but Professor Naj, who invited me to give the talk today, Patrick McCoy, who helped me, and Stephen with trying to get those sound recordings right. Chris Thor, who helped me with the PowerPoint last year, and Johnny, and especially Dr. Anne O'Connor, and also everybody at the at Boston College and the Burns Library. So Gurmila Mahagad.